Story number 1.
No one believed Clara when she said the house was haunted. She had moved in 2 weeks ago, thrilled to finally have a place of her own. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom rental on the edge of town, but it was hers. The house was old, with creaky wooden floors and outdated fixtures, but she loved the charm of it. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, little things started happening. The first night she noticed it, she was brushing her teeth before bed. The bathroom door, which had been open, slowly swung shut, not slammed, not creaked, just closed. She frowned, stepping forward to open it again. Maybe there was a draft. But when she tested it, the door didn't move on its own. Odd, but she shrugged it off. The next night, she heard the footsteps. It was around midnight. She had been reading in bed, the soft glow of her bedside lamp casting shadows against the walls. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wood settling. Then, soft, deliberate steps. Coming from the hallway. She froze, her fingers tightening around the book in her hands. The footsteps were slow, steady. Not the random noises a house makes at night. This was different. Someone was walking outside her bedroom door. Clara held her breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't name. She told herself it was her imagination, that she had just been too tired and hearing things. But she couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, she checked the locks. The front door was secure. The windows were shut. There was no sign that anyone had been in the house. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, it got worse. She was just about to fall asleep when she heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. But this time, they didn't stop outside her door. They entered the room. Her body went rigid. She didn't dare move, barely even breathed. She could hear them, soft steps on the wooden floor moving closer to her bed. Her heart pounded in her chest, every muscle in her body screaming at her to move, to run. But she couldn't. The air around her grew ice cold. Then, she felt it. A weight at the foot of her bed, like someone sitting down, a soft creak of the mattress. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the sheets so tightly her knuckles ached. She wanted to turn on the light, to look, but some deep instinct told her not to. Minutes passed. The weight didn't move. She lay there, frozen, until exhaustion finally took over, pulling her into a restless sleep. By morning, everything was normal again. No sign that anything had happened. But Clara knew better. She called her best friend, Megan, later that day. "You probably just dreamed it," Megan said. "You've been stressed with the move. Maybe you're just imagining things." Clara wanted to believe her, but deep down she knew she wasn't. That night, she kept the lights on. At exactly 2:42 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open. Clara sat up so fast her vision blurred. The door had been closed when she went to bed. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Then, from the darkness beyond the doorway, a whisper, soft, barely audible. "You can't leave." Clara's blood ran cold. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. She turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the doorway. The hall was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavy, charged with something unseen. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she packed a bag. She didn't care if she was overreacting. She wasn't staying in that house another night. Megan offered to let her crash at her place for a few days. Clara was relieved until she checked the security camera footage from her phone. She had installed a small camera facing the hallway when she moved in, just for safety reasons. She pulled up the footage from the night before, her hands shaking. At 2:42 a.m., the bedroom door opened on its own. Then, a shadow. Tall. Thin. Moving just past the doorway. It didn't have a face. It just stood there, watching. Clara dropped her phone. She left the house that day and never went back. A week later, the landlord called her. "There's something you should know," he said. His voice was hesitant. "I don't normally tell tenants this, but the last girl who lived there, she said the same things. Noises at night, doors moving. She left in a hurry, too." Clara's throat tightened. "What happened to her?" she asked. A long pause. "She disappeared," the landlord said. "Never found her." Clara hung up without saying another word. She never spoke of the house again. But sometimes in the silence of her new apartment, she still wakes up at 2:42 a.m., and in the quiet, just beyond the edge of the darkness, she swears she hears a whisper. "You can't leave." Story the end. David never believed in ghosts. He always thought of hauntings as overactive imaginations, people looking for something to explain away ordinary things. He wasn't the type to jump at shadows or feel unsettled in an empty house. That was before he moved into the cabin. It was supposed to be temporary, just 6 months. A cheap rental on the outskirts of a small town, far enough away from the city to give him peace and quiet while he worked remotely. It was an old place, probably built in the early 1900s, but the rent was unbeatable, and the landlord had barely asked any questions before handing over the keys. The first few nights were quiet, just the usual noises, creaky floorboards, the wind against the windows. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick, stretching for miles, and at night, the silence was absolute. But by the end of the first week, something changed. It started with the knocking. David had been working late, sitting at his desk with only the glow of his laptop lighting the room. He had a habit of losing track of time, and when he finally glanced at the clock, it was nearly 1:30 a.m. Then he heard it. A soft, deliberate knock. Not from the front door, not from the windows, from inside the house. His pulse quickened. He turned his head toward the hallway that led to the bedroom, waiting. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, rhythmic taps coming from the far end of the house. David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The cabin was small, only 4 rooms. If someone was inside, there weren't many places to hide. Grabbing the flashlight from his desk, he stepped into the hallway. The air felt different, heavier somehow. He checked the bedroom first. Empty. The closet. Nothing. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. He nudged it open with his foot, shining the light inside. Nothing. But the knocking had sounded so real. He checked the entire house, his breath tight in his chest. Every door was locked, every window shut. He told himself it had been the wind, that maybe the old wood had shifted. He went to bed uneasy, but eventually exhaustion won. The next night, it happened again. 1:30 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. David's eyes snapped open. This time, he was sure it was coming from inside the house. He sat up, his skin crawling. The air felt colder than before, the silence pressing against his ears. Then the whisper. Faint. Almost too soft to hear, his stomach clenched. It was coming from the hallway. He forced himself to move, grabbing his phone and turning on the flashlight. The hallway was empty. But the bedroom door, it was open. David knew he had closed it before going to bed, but that his heart pounded as he stepped out into the hallway. The air was thick, suffocating. He could feel something there, just out of sight. He checked every room again, his skin crawling with the sense of being watched. But as before, nothing. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. For the next 3 nights, the knocking came at the exact same time. 1:30 a.m., always from inside the house. By the 4th night, he decided to set up his phone to record. He placed it in the hallway, propped against the wall, and went to bed, waiting. At 1:30 a.m., the knocking came again. His entire body tensed, but he didn't move. He just lay there, barely breathing, waiting for it to stop. When morning came, he grabbed his phone with shaking hands. The footage was normal, at first. Then at exactly 1:30 a.m., the camera glitched, a faint, blurry movement. The hallway light flickered. Then, a shadow. Tall, thin, standing at the end of the hallway, motionless. The knock came again, and the shadow moved, just slightly, shifting closer to the camera. David's stomach turned to ice. The shadow had no face. And then, the whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but it was there, low, almost distant, like something speaking from underwater. Then, the video ended. David dropped the phone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. That was it. He was done. He packed his bags within the hour. He didn't care if he had paid for 6 months. He wasn't staying another night. But as he grabbed his car keys and reached for the front door, the bedroom door slammed shut behind him. Hard. David spun around, his heart in his throat. The entire house felt wrong, the air buzzing like static. Then, the knocking. This time it came from the walls. Knock, 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 from the floor, from the ceiling. Surrounding him, he ran. He didn't stop until he was in his car, speeding down the empty road, away from the cabin, away from whatever had been waiting for him in that house. He never went back. A few weeks later, he got a call from the landlord. "You left in a hurry," the man said. His voice was amused, but there was something else beneath it. "Did you see something?" David didn't answer. The landlord chuckled. "You wouldn't be the first," he said. "That place has a history." David hesitated. What kind of history? Another chuckle. Let's just say no one stays long. David hung up. He never spoke about the cabin again, but sometimes, even in his new apartment, miles away from that place, he still wakes up at 1:30 a.m., and in the silence just beyond the edge of his vision, he swears he hears it. Knock, knock, knock. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It started the night I moved into the apartment. It wasn't a great place. Small, old, with creaky floors and walls so thin I could hear my neighbors sneeze. But it was cheap, and I needed cheap. After breaking up with my girlfriend and losing my job in the same week, I had no choice but to take whatever I could afford. The landlord, an older man with yellowed fingers from years of smoking, barely looked at me when he handed over the keys. He muttered something about keeping to myself and not bothering the other tenants. I thought it was an odd thing to say, but I just nodded and took the keys. The first few days were uneventful. I worked during the day, landed a job at a warehouse loading boxes, so by the time I got home, I was too exhausted to do much more than eat and sleep. Then, on the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. Soft. Slow. 3 knocks. It came from inside the apartment. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. Knock, knock, knock. This time I could tell it was coming from the closet. A chill ran through me. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. Slowly I climbed out of bed, feeling the floorboards creak under my weight. I hesitated, then yanked the closet door open. Empty. Just the old wooden rod, some wire hangers left behind by the previous tenant, and a faint, musty smell. I let out a shaky breath. Probably just the old building settling, I told myself. I was already sleep-deprived from work. Maybe I imagined it. I shut the door and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, the knocking came at exactly 3:12 a.m. 3 soft, deliberate knocks from the closet. I didn't move. I just laid there, listening, my body frozen. Then, just as I convinced myself to ignore it, the doorknob rattled. A violent, jerking motion. Like something was trying to open it from the inside. I bolted out of bed, heart hammering. The rattling stopped. Silence. I stared at the closet door, my breath coming in short gasps. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and held it like a weapon. Slowly, I approached the door. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what might be on the other side. But I had to. With a deep breath, I reached for the knob. Cold. Colder than it should have been. I turned it and pulled the door open in one quick motion. Nothing. Just like before. I stood there for a long time, listening to my own pulse hammer in my ears. Then I shut the door again. That morning, I asked the landlord if the apartment had any issues. He looked at me for a long moment before lighting a cigarette. "You hear it yet?" he asked. I felt my stomach drop. "What?" He exhaled a long stream of smoke. The knocking. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me he was joking, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "Happened to the last guy, too. Before him, another guy. Always at night. Always from the closet." I swallowed hard. Did they ever see anything?" He shook his head. Never lasted long enough to find out. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. What happened to them? "Moved out," he said simply. "Left in the middle of the night. No warning." I almost asked more questions, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to know. That night, I locked the closet door. It didn't help. At 3:12 a.m., the knocking started again. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. Then, the door creaked open, even though I had locked it. My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe. The room felt different, heavier. I didn't move. I couldn't. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. I ran. Didn't even grab my shoes. I bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street, gasping for air. I didn't go back. Not that night. Not ever. The landlord never called, never asked why I left. I didn't need to tell him. He already knew. Weeks later, I checked online for anything about the building. An article from 1996. A tenant found dead in my apartment, in the closet. Cause of death? Unknown. The article said he had been found curled up inside, his hands covering his ears, his eyes wide open in terror, like he had been trying to block something out, or someone. I don't know who or what knocked on my door at 3:12 a.m., and I don't ever want to find out. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Nathan had never been afraid of being alone. He actually liked it. Growing up as an only child in a quiet household, he had learned to appreciate solitude. Even as an adult, he preferred silence over crowds, which was why he had no problem taking the night security job at an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for years. Budget cuts, apparently. There were still old medical equipment and paperwork scattered around, like the staff had left in a hurry. The city was still deciding what to do with the building, but until then, someone needed to keep watch to make sure squatters didn't break in. Nathan had been on the job for about a month. The pay wasn't great, but the work was easy. He sat at his desk in the front lobby, watching the security monitors, doing rounds every few hours to make sure everything was still locked up. Nothing ever happened. Until the night it did. It started with the elevators. The building had 3 floors, and although the elevators were old, they still worked. The strange part was that they never moved unless someone pushed the button. That night, at exactly 1:13 a.m., one of them did. Nathan had been staring at the monitors when he saw it. The elevator on the 2nd floor lit up. The doors opened, then closed. His stomach clenched. No one else was in the building. He checked the cameras. The hallway was empty. He told himself it was just a malfunction, maybe an old wiring issue. He grabbed his flashlight and decided to check it out. The 2nd floor was always the creepiest. Most of the rooms still had old hospital beds covered in dust, IV stands in the corners like skeletal remains. The air was stale, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly as Nathan stepped out of the stairwell. The elevator doors were closed when he got there. He pressed the button. The doors slid open, revealing an empty interior. A malfunction. That had to be it. Then he heard it. A soft shuffle, like someone moving just down the hall. Nathan's skin prickled. He aimed the flashlight toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. He took a step forward. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Then, another sound. This time a whisper. Faint, impossible to make out. Nathan's grip tightened on the flashlight. He knew the building was empty. He had locked every door. He turned back toward the elevator, ready to head downstairs. The doors shut. The button panel on the wall lit up. The elevator was going up, to the 3rd floor. Nathan hesitated. He could just go back to the lobby, pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something inside him, maybe curiosity, maybe something else, made him take the stairs instead. The 3rd floor was darker than the rest. Most of the lights didn't work, and the emergency backup system had long since failed. Nathan's flashlight was the only source of illumination as he stepped into the hallway. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock from one of the patient rooms. His breath hitched. The sound came again. Knock. Knock, knock. Room 306. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. He stood there, frozen, telling himself to leave, to go back downstairs and pretend none of this was happening. Instead, he stepped forward. The door to 306 was slightly open. The knock came one last time, right as he reached for the handle. Then, the whisper, right behind him. Nathan spun around so fast he nearly dropped the flashlight. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the air was wrong, heavy. The kind of silence that felt like something was holding its breath, waiting. He turned back to the door. It was open wider now. His mouth went dry. He had not touched it. Nathan swallowed hard and aimed his flashlight inside. The room was like the others, an empty hospital bed, cabinets with broken doors, dust covering everything. But the bed, the sheets were rumpled, like someone had been lying there. His pulse hammered in his ears. A cold breeze brushed against his neck. Nathan backed away, his legs trembling. He turned and hurried toward the stairwell, and forcing himself not to run, not to look back. By the time he reached the lobby, his hands were shaking. He locked the stairwell door behind him, breathing hard. He stared at the monitors. Everything was normal. No movement, no sign of anything. But he knew what he had heard. That night, he didn't finish his shift. He left an hour early, something he had never done before. The next day, he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. The security system automatically recorded every night. Nathan hesitated before pressing play, his stomach twisting into knots. At 1:13 a.m., the elevator doors opened. But this time, the footage showed something else. A shadow, tall, thin, standing just inside the elevator. Nathan's blood turned to ice. The shadow didn't have a face. And then, the whisper. Not from the speakers, not from the video, from right behind him. Nathan didn't turn around. He ran. He quit the job the next morning. Didn't even go back for his last paycheck. Weeks later, he looked up the history of the hospital. room 306. The last patient to stay there had been a man named Daniel Whitmore. He had died alone, unnoticed for hours, maybe longer. By the time anyone had found him, it was too late. Nathan never went back to that building, but sometimes in the middle of the night, he wakes up at exactly 1:13 a.m. And in the silence, just beyond the edge of his vision, he swears he hears it. A whisper and a slow, deliberate knock. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Michael never considered himself superstitious. He was a man of logic, grounded in facts, not ghost stories. He had lived alone for years without ever feeling uncomfortable in an empty house, and he certainly never believed in the idea that something unseen could be watching him. That was before he moved into the house on Maple Street. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After his divorce, Michael needed a quiet place to rebuild his life. He found the old house for a surprisingly low price. Too low, really, but he didn't question it. The house was a 2-story colonial, built in the 1920s with creaky floorboards and old wooden doors that stuck in the frames. The previous owner had moved out suddenly, leaving some of the furniture behind, and the real estate agent seemed in a hurry to sell it. Michael didn't care. It was private, affordable, and perfect for a man who just wanted to be left alone. The first few nights passed without incident. He spent his evenings unpacking, drinking beer on the back porch, and getting used to the eerie silence of the place. The house settled in strange ways, popping, creaking at odd hours, but he told himself it was just the old wood shifting with the temperature. Then, around the 5th night, he woke up to the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, moving across the hallway outside his bedroom. His heart pounded as he sat up in bed, listening. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside his window. The footsteps stopped. Michael held his breath. He waited, straining to hear anything else. Silence. Maybe it had been a dream, or maybe the old house was just making noises again. He laid back down, convincing himself that it was nothing, but the next night it happened again. This time, he was sure he was awake when he heard them. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. They moved from the hallway to the top of the staircase, stopping just outside his door. Michael grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside his bed and stood up, his pulse racing. He wasn't afraid of intruders, he knew how to handle himself, but something about this felt different. He yanked the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like someone had just been there. A faint draft brushed against his skin, sending a chill down his spine. He checked every room, every closet, every locked door. Nothing. By morning, he was exhausted. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination, that his mind was playing tricks on him because he wasn't used to the house yet. But then, things started moving. Small things at first. His keys, which he always left on the kitchen counter, would be in the living room instead. A chair in the dining room would be slightly pulled out when he knew he had pushed it in. One morning, he woke up to find every cabinet in the kitchen wide open. Michael stood there, staring at them in disbelief. He had been alone in the house all night. He had locked the doors. There was no way anyone had gotten inside. But the worst part, the part that made his blood turn cold, was that he had heard nothing. No footsteps, no creaking wood, just silence. He started sleeping with the bat in his hand. Every light in the house turned on. Then around 2 weeks in, the whispering began. At first, he thought it was the wind. A faint, almost inaudible sound, like a voice carried through the walls. But as the nights passed, it became clearer. Not words, not at first, just the sound of breath right next to his ear when he was on the verge of sleep. One night, he woke up suddenly, heart hammering. The room was silent, but then, a whisper. Right behind him, he bolted upright, flipping on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. The air was ice cold. Michael barely slept after that. He started staying out late, avoiding the house as much as he could. But no matter where he went, he knew he had to come back eventually. And every night, the footsteps returned. The whispering grew louder. Then the knocking started. It came at exactly 3:15 a.m., a slow, deliberate knock at his bedroom door. Michael would sit there, gripping his bat, staring at the door, waiting. It never opened, but the knock would come again. Knock, knock, knock. One night, he worked up the courage to yank the door open the second he heard it. Nothing, just the empty hallway. But as he stood there, holding his breath, the air around him grew thick, suffocating. A shape, a shadow darker than the darkness itself, standing at the end of the hall. Michael couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whisper came again. This time, it was right against his ear. He stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut. That was the moment he knew. He wasn't alone in the house. Something was there, watching, waiting. The next morning, he made a decision. He had to leave. He didn't care about selling the house, about losing money. He just needed to get out. He started packing immediately, shoving clothes and belongings into a suitcase with shaking hands. Then he heard it, the creaking, slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the stairs. Michael froze. His bedroom door was open. The hallway stretched out in front of him, and at the top of the staircase, a figure, tall, motionless. It had no face, just darkness. Michael's breath hitched. The figure tilted its head, and then it moved, fast, rushing toward him. Michael slammed the bedroom door shut, locking it, bracing himself against it as his pulse thundered in his ears. The knocking returned, harder this time, pounding. The whispering turned to something else, something inhuman, a rasping, guttural sound. Michael yanked the window open, climbed out onto the roof, and jumped. He ran, didn't stop. Not until he was in his car, tearing down the road, leaving that house behind. He never went back. He sold the house at a loss, never explaining why. Months later, curiosity got the better of him. He looked up the history of the house. The previous owner, found dead in the upstairs hallway. No signs of forced entry, no cause of death, just gone. Vanished, like he had been erased from existence. Michael never spoke of the house again, but sometimes even in his new apartment, miles away from Maple Street, he still wakes up at 3:15 a.m., and in the silence, just beyond the edge of his vision, he swears he hears it, the whisper, and a slow, deliberate knock. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard stories, read books, even enjoyed a good horror movie now and then, but to me, they were just that, stories. Things made up to scare people, to keep children from wandering too far into the woods or to explain noises that had perfectly logical explanations. That was before the night I spent alone in my grandmother's house. It wasn't a haunted-looking place, just a small, one-story home in a quiet rural town. It sat on the edge of a long stretch of empty farmland with a narrow road leading to the main part of town. I had spent summers there as a kid, running through the backyard, helping my grandmother bake cookies, and falling asleep to the gentle hum of cicadas outside my window. There was nothing ominous about it, until she passed away. I was the only family member who could get time off work to handle the estate, so I made the trip alone, figuring it would be easy, sort through her things, clean up, and put the house on the market. Simple. I arrived just before sunset. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and the distant smoke of a neighbor burning leaves. I parked in the gravel driveway, stepped out, and immediately felt it. The change. The house looked the same. White siding, flower boxes beneath the windows, the porch swing swaying gently in the wind. But it felt different. The warmth I remembered was gone, replaced by a stillness that made my skin prickle. I chalked it up to nerves. Grief. That's what I told myself as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and old wood. Everything was just as she had left it. The lace doilies on the tables, the china cabinet filled with delicate teacups, the framed pictures of my grandfather who had died long before I was born. I wandered through the rooms, running my fingers along familiar surfaces, memories flickering through my mind. It was quiet. Too quiet. No hum of cicadas now, no distant chatter from a television. Just silence. That first night, I settled into the guest room, the one I had always slept in as a child. The bed was smaller than I remembered, the quilt heavier. I left the door slightly open, the way I always had when I was younger, letting a sliver of light from the hallway spill in. I fell asleep easily. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were soft but distinct, moving slowly across the hardwood floor. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. I held my breath, listening. They stopped. For a long moment, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Maybe the house was settling. Old wood shifts, expands. I exhaled and turned onto my side, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Then the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer. They stopped just outside my door. A cold sweat broke out over my skin. I turned my head toward the doorway, barely breathing. The sliver of light was gone. Something was standing there. I couldn't see it. There was no shape, no outline, but the light that had been spilling into my room was completely blocked, as if something massive stood in the hallway. I didn't move. I couldn't. I listened. No breathing, no shifting, just silence. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. It felt like forever. Then, slowly, the light returned. The space in front of my door was empty again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Sleep paralysis, maybe. I had read about that before. It made sense. I busied myself with cleaning, sorting through my grandmother's belongings, trying to distract myself from the lingering unease that clung to me like a shadow. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house felt even heavier. The air thick with something unseen, something watching. I left every light on. At midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were in the kitchen. I lay frozen in bed, straining to listen. The soft creak of floorboards, the gentle scrape of something moving across the counter. Then, a cupboard door slammed. I bolted upright, my pulse thundering in my ears. Silence. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the blankets, staring at the open doorway. Then I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it, a breath of sound just outside my room. "Get out!" The hairs on my arms stood up. A chill spread through my entire body, deep and paralyzing. I wanted to run, to grab my keys and leave, drive through the night and never look back. But something told me not to move. It didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to see it. And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath caught in my throat. The floor creaked just outside my door. The air felt wrong, thick, charged, suffocating. And then, nothing. The house was silent. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the sun was rising, golden light spilling through the curtains. Everything looked normal, safe, but I knew better. That day, I packed up what little I had brought with me. I didn't care about selling the house anymore. It could sit there forever, empty and waiting. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift, like something was letting me go. I never went back. I don't know what was in that house. I don't want to know. But I still dream about it. And my dreams, the hallway light is always blocked by something that isn't there. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I never used to be scared of being alone. I liked it, actually. I enjoyed the quiet, the space to think. But one night changed that forever. It happened a year ago when I took a job as a night security guard at an old office building downtown. The building had been there for nearly 100 years, a relic of a time when people still built things with character. Marble floors, high ceilings, thick wooden doors with brass handles that had been worn down by decades of use. It had once been a bank, then a law office, and now it was just a collection of empty offices rented out to small businesses that barely kept the lights on. My job was simple: stay in the security room, do a few patrols, lock up at midnight, and wait until morning. Easy money, so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful. I walked the hallways, checked the locks, and passed the time watching old movies on my phone. The building was eerie at night, sure, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. Then, on my fourth night, something changed. It started with a noise. I was sitting in the security office sipping my coffee when I heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A soft, scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. I checked the monitors. The grainy black and white footage showed the usual empty hallways, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Nothing looked out of place. I told myself it was the pipes. The building was old, after all. I had heard strange noises before. But then it happened again. Long, slow, deliberate. It came from the second floor. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the railing tightly. The second floor was even quieter than the first, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. I walked down the main corridor, scanning the offices as I passed. The doors were all shut, locked just as they had been when I did my rounds earlier. And then I saw it. The door at the end of the hall. It was open. Just slightly, but enough that I knew it hadn't been like that before. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering as if struggling to stay alive. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The office was empty. Just an old desk, a few chairs, and a tall filing cabinet pushed against the wall. Nothing that should have made a noise. I shined my flashlight across the room, my pulse pounding. Nothing. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Low. Right behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat. The room was empty. The air had changed, though. It felt colder, heavy in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed out, shutting the door firmly behind me. I told myself I was imagining things. That exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I hurried back downstairs, locking the security office door behind me. I kept the monitors in my sight, my ears straining for any sound. Hours passed. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the motion sensor alarm on the second floor went off. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I stared at the blinking light on the panel. The sensors only triggered if something moved. I forced myself to check the monitors. At first, I didn't see anything. The hallways were still, the doors shut. Then, on camera 3, I saw it. A shadow. Not a person, not an object. Just a darkness, standing in the middle of the hallway. It didn't move, it didn't shift. It just stood there. The hairs on my arms stood up. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. The alarm stopped. The hallway was empty. I sat frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. And then the radio crackled. The radio that I kept on my belt. A burst of static, then a voice. Low, distant. Leave. I dropped the radio. My hands were shaking. My skin was cold with sweat. I wasn't imagining this. I grabbed my phone and called my supervisor, but the call wouldn't go through. No service. That wasn't possible. I had been using my phone all night. Then the doorknob rattled. The security office door. I stared at it, heart slamming against my ribs. It was locked. It had to be. But something was on the other side. A soft, rhythmic knocking began. 3 slow taps. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. The knocking stopped. Silence. And then the door unlocked. I heard the soft click of the bolts sliding free. I didn't wait. I ran. I burst through the door, sprinting down the hallway, not daring to look back. The building felt endless, the air thick with something unseen. My footsteps echoed wildly as I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. I reached the front doors and shoved against them, expecting resistance. They flew open. Cold night air hit my face like a slap. I stumbled outside, gasping, my lungs burning. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I looked back, the building was silent. Still. But in the second floor window, I saw it, a shadow, standing there, watching me. I quit that night, never went back. The company called me, left messages, but I never answered. A month later, I read that the building had been condemned. Something about structural issues, unsafe conditions. I knew the truth. Something was in there, and it didn't want to be alone. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I never used to be afraid of the dark. Not until that night. It happened 3 years ago when I was house-sitting for my cousin, Jake. He had just bought his first home, an old fixer-upper on the edge of town. It was a 2-story house built sometime in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors and doors that never quite shut right. Jake had only been living there a few months, and when he got the chance to go on a last-minute work trip, he asked me to stay and keep an eye on the place. I agreed. It seemed easy enough. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The house made the usual old home noises, wood settling, pipes groaning, but nothing that felt out of place. I spent my time watching TV, eating takeout, and scrolling through my phone. Then, on the 3rd night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a sound that sent ice through my veins. Footsteps. Not the soft creaks of an old house shifting, but deliberate, heavy steps, coming from upstairs. I lay there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. Jake's house had 3 bedrooms upstairs, but I had no reason to go up there. He had told me that the previous owner had died in the house, though he didn't give me details. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, lying there in the dark, I wished I had asked. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, moving across the 2nd floor. Then they stopped, right above me. I held my breath, listening so hard my head started to pound. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I pulled up the flashlight. The dim glow cast eerie shadows across the walls, but everything downstairs looked normal. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not from upstairs, from the hallway. 3 slow knocks against the wall, just outside my door. I couldn't breathe. I forced myself to sit up, my pulse hammering. The bedroom door was closed, but the sliver of light beneath it was undisturbed. I told myself it was the pipes, the wind, anything but what my gut was telling me. And then the doorknob turned. Not violently, not with force, just slowly, as if someone was testing it, seeing if it was locked. I threw myself backward, pressing against the headboard, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. The knob stopped moving. Silence. Then the footsteps started again. But they weren't coming from upstairs anymore. They were coming down the stairs, one slow step at a time. I wanted to run to get out of that house, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was anchored to the bed, suffocated by some unseen force. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Then, nothing. I strained my ears, waiting. Then a soft exhale, just on the other side of my door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows like nothing had happened. The house was still empty. But I knew I wasn't alone. I spent the day trying to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis? A dream? But it felt too real. That night, I made sure every light was on. I turned the TV volume up, anything to make the house feel less empty. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the air changed. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed darker. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they started downstairs, and they were coming toward me. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding as I forced myself to move. I wasn't going to wait. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The house was silent, but I could feel something watching me. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock. The air felt thick, charged, like something was standing right behind me. As I threw open the door, a sound echoed through the house, a whisper, right against my ear. Stay. I ran. I never went back. Jake sold the house a few months later. He never told me why. Story the end.